Pray with me, please. Be with us this morning, God. Quiet our hearts. May our spirits be still, that we might hear from you. Amen. Always be humble and kind. That's the advice that country music star Tim McGraw gives to his young daughters in his hit song, Humble and Kind. Bitterness keeps you from flying, he sings. So always be humble and kind. It's a wonderful little song. It's a sweet sentiment from a father to his coming-of-age daughters. And moreover, it's a welcome reminder for us as listeners of what really matters in our day-to-day lives. And I bring that song up this morning because as a father with young daughters myself, both of whom are about to start school back tomorrow, I find myself thinking of the words that I want to convey to them as they embark upon this new year. Because let's face it, school can be tough. And children can be cruel. Yes, even preschool and kindergarten can be tough. And I don't just mean the academic bit, though of course learning anything new is difficult, but principally I mean that social bit. Learning to interact with your peers is difficult. And as I said, children can be particularly cruel. For human nature, so clearly on display in young children, can lead to some of the worst insults and exclusions and rejections and teardowns that one could imagine. We all know that's true. And thus, as a father, I have been thinking of what I want to tell my children as they enter into this social arena tomorrow. I want to tell them to play with the kid with whom no one else is playing. I want to tell them to share their snack, even if they want the whole thing for themselves. I want to tell them to mind their teachers and show them respect, even if they don't like what their teachers have to say. I want to tell them to always give their best in everything, but to never feel that their worthiness is tied up in whether they are the best in everything. Yes, I want to tell them all of this, and I want to tell them so much more. But here's the thing. They are 4 and 5. How much of this can they really understand? How much of this can they really process before their little eyes begin to glaze over? Very little. And so in the end, I've determined that at least for now, the best advice that I can give my daughters as they start back to school is the same advice that Tim McGraw gave to his daughters. To simply say, always be humble and kind. Now we can all agree on this message, right? I saw some smiles on some faces and some heads nodding when I was using those words from Tim McGraw. Sure I did, because this is a message that resonates with us as adults. This is a message that elicits our deep approval. It's a matter of course for us. We don't even question the validity of those words, right? Well, this too is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. About how universal is the impulse that we adults have to teach our children to be kind to others. As a parent, I've been thinking about how natural it is for us to teach these lessons to our children, how involuntary even. It's almost as if this message takes place on autopilot. As if the awareness that we are to tell our children things like this exists on some deeper, more unconscious level than most of the other things that we teach our children. For whereas we differ on so many other things in our adult philosophies, we all agree, without even thinking about it, that this is a central lesson we need to instill in our children. Treat others as you would like to be treated. If you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. Always treat others with respect. Always be humble and kind. But so here's the thing. Here's the reason I've been thinking about this universal default philosophy of ours of late. Here's the reason why I've been struck by how widespread our agreement on this teaching is. I've been struck by it because it's increasingly clear to me that we as adults are not so good at practicing it ourselves. Am I not right? We're really good at telling our children that they should be humble and kind, and that they should treat others with respect, and that they should take up for and not look down on the weaker among them, and that they ought not to say anything unless they have something nice and kind to say. Oh, we're really good at telling our children that. But then we are so quick to hurl insults at others, and so quick to disrespect the character and the ideas and the opinions of others, and so quick to resent those who, unlike us, struggle to stand on their own 2 feet, and so quick to say the most vile, mean-spirited things to and about others. We're so quick to do these things and then assume that because those others see the world differently from us, or because they hold different political or philosophical or theological opinions than us, or because they live somewhere different from us or practice a different way of life than us, that somehow, because of these differences, our default instruction to our children about how they should live out their lives is somehow rendered no longer applicable for us concerning how we ought to live out our own. And if you think I'm wrong about that, let me just ask a quick question, a quick diagnostic. How would you best describe the world today and the interactions happening in it? Would you call it kind? Would you call it gracious? Would you say that it's marked by humble people treating others with humility and fairness and respect? Or would you say we're living in a world increasingly marked by resentment and accusation? A world where the premium is increasingly placed on takedowns and solid burns. A world where we increasingly celebrate those who best divide us rather than honor those who seek to unify us. The question, at least in my opinion, is a rhetorical one. But just turn on the television or open up a newspaper or log into Facebook or simply go to the grocery store and tell me that what you principally hear coming from the adults whom you watch and read and view and listen to is not pure venom. Not all of it, of course, but a whole lot of it, right? Mean-spirited, uncompassionate, ungracious venom. And my point, this ubiquitous venom coming from us, from the same adults who, without even considering the contradiction, think it nonetheless vital that we teach our children to always be humble and kind. It's a stunning paradox. Okay, let's shift gears for a moment. The Greek word that is usually translated in the New Testament as faith, or its Greek cognate belief, the Greek word pistis, most often means trust in rather than mere belief about, which is another way of saying that in the New Testament, the Christian call to faith and belief is less about one's intellectual assent to something as it is about his or her practice of that belief. And so, for instance, when Jesus says in John's Gospel that the work of God is to believe in the one whom God sent, what Jesus means by belief is something far deeper and far harder and far more profound than mere intellectual assent. He's referring to believing in something so much that one actually practices it. He's referring to believing in something so much that that belief becomes intrinsic to the way one engages the world. Now, I highlight this distinction between belief about and trust in because it's of deep relevance to our epistle lesson from Ephesians this morning. Here in this letter from Paul, we see that this disconnect between believing the idea and neglecting the practice was not something exclusive to us as adults in the 21st century. For in this epistle, we see Paul, some 2,000 years ago, having to deal with this same disconnect in the adults in the church that he's just recently planted in Ephesus. For just a few years now, they've been sharing their lives together, and already they are bickering like children. In fact, not just bickering, but belittling one another, and treating the wealthy with favor, but dismissing the poor, and clinging tight to those who agree with them, but shunning those who don't, and creating little factions and in-groups, and criticizing one another for the pettiest of reasons, just tearing one another down instead of building one another up. And so we see Paul write to them this: we are members of one another. So let no evil come out of your mouths, but only what is useful for building up, so that your words may give grace to those who hear them. Therefore, he goes on, put away all bitterness and wrath and anger and wrangling and slander and malice, and be kind to one another. I sometimes wish the Apostle Paul could preempt all of our television stations. You know, kind of like when the president has a pressing matter to share with the country, stopping everything to get our collective attention. I sometimes wish that the Apostle Paul could preempt everything and simply say these words, that he might simply say these words and somehow break the spell of pettiness and indecency that we seem to be living under, that he might look right into the camera and say, we are members of one another. So let no more evil come out of your mouths, but only what is useful for building up, so that your words may give grace to those who hear them. Put away from you all bitterness and wrath and anger and wrangling and slander, and be kind to one another. I sometimes wish the Apostle Paul could do that for us. What a breath of fresh air that would be. Okay, let's shift gears again. C.S. Lewis writes, I told you you were going to get used to hearing me say that. C.S. Lewis writes in Mere Christianity about how we are to be mirrors for one another. Mirrors in whose reflection others see themselves as they really are, that is, as loved by God, or as they're not, as vile and wretched creatures. That's not Lewis's language, by the way. I'm paraphrasing all this, but here's what Lewis means by this. He means that we, through our kindness and our gentleness and our humility, can either encourage someone, or that we can, through our bitterness and our resentment and our condescension, tear someone down. He means that we can be humble and kind, people who share with others words and gestures of grace that they desperately need to hear, or that we can be proud and mean-spirited, tearing others down when what they need more than anything is to be built up. That, Lewis writes, is the awesome responsibility placed on our shoulders as human beings. And that, Lewis writes, is what it means to be a living mirror. Okay, let's tie this all together now. On a day when we bless our children as they prepare to head back to school, and on a day when we reflect on the difference between believing in something and actually putting that belief into practice, and on a day when we ponder these pressing words from the Apostle Paul to the Ephesians, and on a day when we consider what it might mean to be living mirrors for one another, on such a day, we would do well to think about the words we teach our children about kindness and humility, and then consider how well our own practice actually bears those words out. Because here's the thing. We can't teach our children that they should be humble and kind if we ourselves are defiantly proud people whose words to others are callous and mean-spirited. We just can't. And we can't tell our children to stand up to the bullies in their own lives if we ourselves are cheering on and laughing with the bullies in our own. And we certainly can't reveal to anyone that they are loved by God, which they are, because we all are. We certainly can't reveal to anyone that they are loved by God if we ourselves find them to be vile and wretched. And so, sure, we might disagree with and differ from and deal with the world in wildly dissimilar ways from one another. But as Paul reminds us, we are part of one another. And thus, if we are going to call ourselves disciples, not just believers, but disciples, then we, like the Ephesians, must also put behind us all bitterness and wrath and anger and slander and start being kind to one another. And while this might sound simple, I assure you it's not. It is perhaps the most difficult work in the world. But that is the reality of true discipleship. To believe in Christ costs nothing. To follow Christ costs everything. And so then I close with this gentle reminder, with this gentle encouragement, with this gentle entreaty. Let us always be humble and kind. As Scottish theologian Ian McLaren famously wrote, "So say I today, everyone we meet is fighting a hard battle." So be kind. Remember that we are all members of one another. Remember that we are all mirrors for one another. And thus remember that in us others should see that they are loved by God, not that they are rejected by us. Yes, in this oftentimes harsh and merciless world, let us, Boulevard Baptist Church, heed Paul's advice. Let us cease speaking words that tear others down. And let us instead speak only that which is useful for building one another up. Let it be, O Lord, let it be. And all God's people said, Amen.